I'm David from Tmol Shilshom. Welcome. Some of you may know what Tmol Shilshom means. I think Agnon would have been very happy tonight. There is an urban, איך אומרים את זה? אגדה אורבנית, legend, that he used to sit and write here, but unfortunately he wasn't alive when we opened Tmol Shilshom 25 years ago. We celebrate this anniversary these days. And I do want to share a story, since Agnon wasn't there anymore when we were about to open this place. I called his daughter Emunah Yaron, who was the Motziah Umeviah. She was the person taking care of Agnon's legacy, Agnon's writings. And you know, I think that till very recently, new things by Agnon have still been published, and that's a big story. Part of it is thanks to Emunah Yaron. Anyway, I called her up and I said, I'm about to open a place called Tmol Shilshom, and I wanted to get her blessing. Even though Tmol Shilshom, as you probably know, was not, the term Tmol Shilshom was not exactly invented by Agnon. It's a biblical expression. But I wanted to be on the safe side, and I also wanted to be tactful. So as I had expected, she was kind of careful and nice, and yet wasn't committing herself too much. And she said we would. She said okay, and we would come and visit. It didn't take very long, and I saw her coming up the stairs, and I greeted her at the door, and I invited her and her husband Chaim Yaron to visit. So she said something which Agnon would have written. She said, "Anachnu lo anashim shel batei kafeh." Okay, we're not people of coffee shops. We're not like in the Agnon times and thought. Being anashim shel bet kafeh would mean being bourgeois, being living luxurious life, which is not what we chalutzim in Eretz Israel are supposed to live, etc., etc., etc. So we stood at the door for about an hour and we schmoozed till eventually she was tired, she was already old, and they walked in and they sat and they had our apple pie and coffee and this and that, and we schmoozed further on for at least 2 more hours. And the punchline of this story is that the very same story has occurred again and again. Each time they came to visit, because they did like this place, they would stand at the door, I would invite them in, they would say, "Anachnu lo anashim shel bet kafeh," and on and on. After an hour, they would be tired, etc., etc. Agnon would have written this better. So I want to welcome you and to greet Rabbi Yosef Jeffrey Sachs and to thank Toby Koren Press for doing this amazing project, and to invite the editor-in-chief of the press to open this evening. Bevakasha.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Good evening and happy Motzei Tu B'Shvat. And welcome to this special evening celebrating the completion of the Toby Press Shay Charka library. After over a decade of work, elaborate translation, meticulous annotations, the 15th and final volume of this series has finally been published. This is a monumental achievement. It's allowed English readers from around the world access to Agnon's stories, his novellas, his novels, sometimes for the first time. It's renewed a worldwide interest in Hebrew's only Nobel-winning author. And perhaps most importantly, not unlike that famous translation into Yiddish of Hamlet, which said on the cover, "Translated and improved by Moshe Schwartz." This series of translations has in some significant ways actually surpassed the original, because the extensive annotations allow readers to penetrate between the lines of Agnon's magnificent prose and see how he distilled an entire canon of Jewish literature into creating essentially modern fiction. The series is on sale tonight outside. Those of you who don't have the full set yet, highly encouraged to complete it tonight at a discount. You can also actually have the volumes autographed by some of the people who created them, which leads me to my thanks, and first and foremost the wonderful expert team of translators, some of whom are here. Who are the translators are here? Please stand up and be acknowledged. No, stand up. The experts that actually brought Agnon's words into the English language. I want to thank the wonderful staff of the Toby Press Cohen Publishers. Specifically, I want to thank the founder and publisher of Toby Press, Mr. Matthew Miller. It was Matthew's vision and personal passion for Agnon which gave rise to this series in the first place. I want to thank David and Small Shisham Cafe for providing us with a perfect Agnonian setting for this evening. I want to thank the Agnon House, co-sponsoring this evening with the Toby Press. And last and absolutely not least, I want to thank tonight's guest of honor, Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. Who is the series editor and the driving force behind what Robert Alter called the heroic task of assembling the Agnon Library in English. Agnon once famously said, he wrote to the literary critic Baruch Kurzweil that he's waiting for him to publish an analysis of his latest novel because everyone is asking him what he meant, and he wants to just say, go and read Baruch Kurzweil. I have a feeling that if Agnon were around today, he would say, go and read Jeffrey Sachs. The very few, if any, have done as much as Jeff to bring Agnon into the 21st century and make his words accessible to readers today. The 15th and final volume, The Outcast, features in an original translation of the Hebrew novella Hanidach, translated by, is Marganit here? Yes. Marganit, stand up and be acknowledged. Masterfully translated by Marganit Weinberger-Rothman. It tells the story of the clash of Hasidism and its opponents, and the way that this historical confrontation works itself out in the heart and mind of one particularly sensitive young man. I'm not going to say more so as not to spoil the novella for you, but hopefully that's enough as a setup for you to understand what you're about to see next. I'd like to welcome Yael Valier and the troupe of Theatre and Theology for a debut abridged version of The Outcast.
All that week, heavy snow fell from the highest heavens to the lowly world. The black earth turned white, the sky remained murky, and the people huddled at home between fireplace and stove. Not a soul ventured out into town. Between the afternoon and evening prayers, a rumor spread around the Beis Medrash. A tzaddik is coming to town!
Gewaldig, Baruch Hashem!
His handful of followers were much heartened by the news. They rejoiced that their rabbi saw fit to spend the Shabbos in their town, and they prepared their hearts and souls to receive the holy man. The common folk assumed that
the rabbi is coming to town for the sole purpose of healing Adela,
the daughter of Rabbi Avigdor, the great pillar of the community. But those who knew how much the great man detested the sect also knew that
I would do anything. I would move heaven and earth to stop this tzaddik from stepping foot in Shibush.
As soon as it was light, the handful of Hasidim went outside the town to welcome the tzaddik. The rabbi is coming! The rabbi is coming! Rabbi Avigdor was outraged.
How long must I have this inadequate stuff going on?
He put on his Shabbos attire, washed his hair, fixed his fur hat, fastened his cloak, and checked himself in the mirror. Rabbi Avigdor made his way to the seat of power, driven by the fury of vengeance. Unfortunately, the nobleman to whom Avigdor turned acceded to the request, and he sent an officer to banish Rabbi Uriel from the town because Rabbi Avigdor had spoken slander against him. Rabbi, a decree has been issued for your expulsion. Please leave the town. Pack up and leave. The rabbi's enemies protested loudly.
Wreak vengeance on your enemies!
Punish them severely for profaning the name of God and for disrupting the celebration of the Shabbos. The holy man looked into his heart.
Uriel, is it really God's honor you care about or your own? And how can you discern which is the truth?
But in the end, human nature prevailed, and he cursed the leader of the community.
One of Rabbi Avigdor's own should be cast out.
Rabbi Uriel left town accompanied by his followers.
Mitzoni ashoymerim ashoymerim boir ikoni mitzoni
L'chodoi dinei seyasoden olina bakfarim.
A spirit of sadness envelops Rabbi Avigdor's house, and pent-up crying struggles to escape. Adela lies in her sickbed. Her illness has no cure. A pure and virtuous soul, she has not yet married off even one of her children. And now the minutes of her life are trickling away. Snow covered the earth, and the house was swathed in shrouds. The light in the lamp dwindled as Adela breathed her last. Her husband, Rabbi Meshulam, stood on one side of her and her father on the other. Rabbi Meshulam threw his hands in the air and cried from his heart, "All hope is lost! I cannot endure it anymore!" And he bolted out of the house. Whither did he turn? Rabbi Meshulam made his way to the village to ask Rabbi Uriel to entreat God to spare the life of his wife, Adela. El na rafan Allah. Rabbi Avigdor was aware of what was going on. He braced his heart with faith in the merciful God who will take pity on her and send her aid from his holy seat. But at that moment, Rabbi Avigdor considered that people are liable to conclude that it was Uriel's prayer that healed his daughter Adela, and thus they will be led astray on her account. Rabbi Avigdor lifted his eyes toward heaven.
Master of the universe, please, take her soul right away, so that the forces of deceit will not arise in the world because of her.
Within minutes, the body's demise was complete, and her soul departed in purity. The Shabbos departed, and with it, all joy. Rabbi Avigdor wrote to his brilliant, precocious, and erudite grandson, the pride of Shibush, who was learning in yeshiva a few hours away.
My dearest grandson, I cannot find consolation because God wreaked his wrath on me. and took from me my only daughter, the apple of my eye. This is my small consolation, that she left behind such a brilliant son. And I hope that you will make a name for yourself among the greatest of the land.
I have one request of you. Although I know you do not associate with irresponsible and reckless people, only with the pious and God-fearing, still, the human heart is unfathomable, and I see fit to warn you against the deceitful sect of Hasidim, who, intoxicated as they are with wine, break God's covenant and now spread over the land like locusts. Beware of this evil, and keep your distance. From then, and God will watch your path, now and evermore. Amen.
Gershom redoubled his studies. He turned night into day, eschewed idle conversation, and did not sleep regularly. But he studied tirelessly, as he felt it was his duty to do. And he became purer and more refined in his suffering. The common folk muttered, rolling their eyes and pointing their fingers.
It is a punishment from heaven.
Rabbi Avigdor provoked the tzaddik, and his offspring must pay for it.
Gershom returned to his hometown on the day before Passover. He spent his days in the study house, studying the Talmud and Jewish law. But spring was already knocking on the windows, and the earth was awash with sunlight. Trees were in bloom, and one day a breeze caught Gershom by his mantle and drew him out to stroll around the town. Gershom wandered into a secluded alley. He saw two men standing by a house, waiting for a 10th person to complete their minyan. So he entered. When inside, they noticed his woeful face and his pleasant demeanor.
It was by chance that led him here.
When they reached the part of the prayer sanctifying God's great name, Gershom realized they were praying according to the Hasidic ritual. When they were done with the evening prayer, they began to dance and sing the holiday song, "You Have Chosen Us," in a pleasant melody. Gershom stood in front of the table, picked up a book in his hand, and covered his face so he would not see Jews acting frivolously. It was not long before Gershom put down the book and focused his eyes on the dance. And even though he was well aware of what they were doing, he watched every movement, and his lips began to softly sing the melody until they finished dancing and wished each other
Good Yom
Tov.
Gershom left the Hasidic prayer house with a sense of vitality and vigor coursing through his limbs. An old man crossed his path.
Shalom Aleichem.
"You're good for nothing? I am almost 70 years old, and I have been living next to that place of worship all my life, and I never, ever set foot there. While you, as soon as you arrived, gave into your Yetzer Hara and entered those people's house." Gershom went back to his study, sitting all day long in the Beis Medrash. When gripped by melancholy, he would not eat or drink, but would sit motionless, reflecting on the vain pleasures of the world, almost to oblivion.
Where is joy to be found?
One of his colleagues at the Beis Medrash said to him, "Is it not written, the precepts of the Lord are upright, rejoicing the heart? Whereas you always study with a sullen face." Gershom's eyes brimmed with tears.
God has found my wickedness, fallen never to rise again, from a high roof to a deep pit. For men look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart.
Some people said,
Gershom is mortifying himself for the sake of the Torah.
but the members of the Hasidic sect pointed their fingers.
The curse of a tzaddik. The curse of a tzaddik has an impact.
Gershom avoided any more encounters with the sect. He read and studied and delved in the manner of traditional Torah scholars until the Chayzer, the secret disciple of Rabbi Uriel, came to town and led him back to his roots. The Chayzer knew that though the people of Shibush were noted for erudition and ethical behavior, their knowledge did not light up their hearts. But it was Erev Shabbos and night had almost fallen, so he took his belongings and went to the shul. Rabbi Avigdor watched him and took to him, so he invited him to dine at the table, and the Chayzer accepted and went home with him. The Chayzer saw that Gershom's soul was a great one. Rabbi Avigdor allocated a room in his house for the two of them to study. The Chayzer felt as if he were sitting in a gloomy cage, a hopeful prisoner preparing Gershom in the antechamber of the Torah, so he can enter into the palace with him. And Gershom sped like a deer toward perfection, and his soul was empowered to its fullest capacity. It was then that the sheath of the tender soul shuddered, and the whole town of Shibush was at once separated from it. Yearnings that the townspeople had never experienced welled up in his heart, shining through his eyes that poured over the Torah and descended heavenward in search of the ineffable. Gershom turned to God the Merciful and cried,
Master of the universe, I wish my heart would pound. This heart you gave me, does it even beat? It hides from your mighty and awful presence, where it should be roaring with unbound love for your God. You created the Garden of Eden, and put a flaming sword at its gate. May my bones burn in hell, so long as one tiny particle of them reaches your throne. But how many firmaments separate one from your Creator? How can the soul ascend to its God?
On Erev Shabbos, the Chayzer entered Gershom's room and took out the Song of Songs. Later in shul, he continued to read until he reached the verse, Draw me, we will run after thee. And when he reached the verse, Draw me, we will run after thee, his soul departed in purity, while he whispered, The king has brought me into his chambers. Thus died Gershom, the grandson of Rabbi Avigdor, because Rabbi Avigdor struggled with Rabbi Uriel and quarreled with Hasidim.
One more round of applause for Rabbi Artie Fisher, Rabbi Dr. Yuda Gelman, Sraya Goldstein, Howard Metz, and Yuda Dovbel Zikin, under the directorship of Yael Valiant, for that wonderful dramatic enactment. Theatre and Theology presents English-speaking theatre that makes you think, combining theatre with the beauties and quirks of religious life and the dramatic arts with scholarship and penetrating discussions. And with that, I'd like to now turn to our two main speakers of this evening, two great Agnonists. Is it Agnonists or Agnonites? Agnonists. Who've played a key role in the Toby Press Schreiber Library. First up, Shay Charka. One of Israel's best-known caricaturists, illustrators, and comic book authors. Amongst his most popular books is his Talmudic comic series, Baba. His political cartoons are featured weekly in the Israeli press, and characters he has created appear on various television networks. Shay illustrated 3 Agnon stories in Hebrew as Shay Agnon Shlosha Sipurim, published as part of our series in English as From Foe to Friend, and most recently Agnon's short story Hasayaf, whose English translations are still awaiting. And once again, to our guest of honor, I don't think anybody here needs to hear the credentials of Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, but for the protocol, the series editor of the Agnon Library, director of research at the Agnon House, and director of Atid and its webyeshiva.org program. And this is hot off the press, the newly named editor of the Tradition Journal. So I'd like to start, before actually diving into Agnon, I want to talk to you about the tricky business that is translation. Because in effect, you are both of you translators. You, Jeff, in the more traditional sense of translation between languages, you took Agnon from Hebrew to English. And you, Shay, who took Agnon to a different medium entirely, from the written word to images. And Yael and Theatre and Theology crew, you took it to yet another medium in your dramatic enactment. Rabbi Yehuda famously in Tractate Kiddushin says, "Hametargem pasuk et tzurato harei ze badai, ve'hamosif alav harei ze mecharef u'megadef." If you translate a verse literally, you're a liar. But if you embellish it in any way, you are a blasphemer. And so I want to ask the two of you how you navigate these two dangerous poles of lying and blaspheming, of translating literally or not translating literally enough. What guides your translation work?
Well, I'm not really sure that I'm a translator. I think I'm not, because I think that a translator is trying to... שומעים?
אתה יכול להגביר, תומר? זה פתוח?
שומעים אותי ככה? כן.
שומעים.
I think that a translator is trying to show other people what is written in the original language. This is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show people what is happening in my mind, in my imagination while I'm reading it. I'm not trying to tell them what Agnon writes or was writing, but what am I reading when I read Agnon. It's
so
totally different.
You are a blasphemer.
Yes, of course.
But the tension between getting it lyrical and getting it literal, I think, guided all of our work in the series. I should say that the series, the 15 volumes, I think I counted it up the other day, comes out to over 5,000 pages of text. Some of the translations had been produced many decades ago. The history of Agnon translation is an interesting story to itself, and we could talk about that some other time. Which stories were translated? This story that we just saw produced, which according to all opinions is one of Agnon's most significant works, wasn't translated until now in our final volume. But other stories, which frankly are not terribly significant, and in Hebrew are not widely known or widely read, were translated 40 and 50 and 60 years ago for any number of reasons. But the trick of balancing between making a beautiful, readable, understandable text, but yet still being anchored in the original is a very great challenge in all translation work, and in Agnon in particular. There was an interesting article on Friday in the Makor Rishon with Israeli literary critic Dan Miron, who said something that I think a lot of people found quite radical, where he suggested that maybe we need to now be translating Agnon and Bialik and Chernichovsky and the other great classics of Hebrew literature into Hebrew, into contemporary Hebrew, because unfortunately contemporary readers are at something of a remove from works that were written 70, 80, 100 years ago. That being said, in Hebrew, there's this kind of notion that Israelis pick up, I guess, at some point around the Bagrut, around the time that they're preparing for their matriculation exams, that you can't read Agnon those of us that grew up in the English-speaking world may have had similar attitudes about Shakespeare or other classics. This is absolutely not true.
I did the book Autumn, and it's very much how I felt.
but it's the same way that we train kids to be afraid of mathematics or afraid of Gemara. These are hard disciplines, and only the super intelligent can. It's absolutely not true. There's no Israeli who can't open Agnon and read it and enjoy it. And from time to time, he'll encounter a word or a phrase or a concept that's foreign to him. And unfortunately, he's carrying around in his pocket the collected wisdom of Western civilization. He could look up a word if he has to. And in the translation, you alluded to this in your very generous introduction. What we've done is try to bridge that gap for the English reader. And in some ways, I encounter this all the time. People ask me, how can you treat Israelis? With the natural chauvinism that everyone has for their own culture and their own language. How can you translate Agnon? How can you read Agnon in English? It's the same thing you would hear in Moscow about Tolstoy and in Paris about Victor Hugo, and every country and its own master. The question isn't so much how can you read Agnon in English, the question is how can you read Agnon today in Hebrew? Not because the words aren't understandable the way people think, but because contemporary Israelis live at such a remove from the culture and the concepts that are being described. So I don't think that they need a translation into Hebrew. They need the kinds of annotations that we prepared. I have a friend and neighbor who lives near us in Ephraim, an Israeli, who I caught reading one of the volumes from the series. I said to him, what the world are you doing? Well, you should be reading in Hebrew. He said, I am reading it in Hebrew, but I'm reading the annotations in English. For whatever reason, the Hebrew volumes, the Hebrew publisher has chosen not to produce them. So that's I think the success of the series was in the work of annotation, which allows the English reader to navigate between the lyricism and the literalism of the work.
Another thing about drawing, I think drawing Agnon is bringing it back to origin, because Agnon himself said that he can tell a story just after he saw it as a picture in his mind. So actually Agnon translated it into language, spoken language, or written into text. In the origin, it's a picture. So I hope that I bring it back to the same picture that he saw, but I can't say it. But
I once told you that Gershom Shalom said about his friend Agnon that he was a man who thought in pictures.
And Agnon himself wrote to Dov Sadan that he can't tell a story that he couldn't see in a picture, in an image. I don't know how to translate it. You have to translate Agnon when writing.
I've often thought that your work is maybe not so much translation as it is a kind of midrash.
That's right.
A type of a visual text that's in dialogue with an original text.
I think it's a new floor that I build on Agnon's text, not trying to take the same text and tell it in a different way, but I'm trying to create something new upon what he created.
Because I'll take it back, you're not going to see them. I'll take it back, you're not going to see them.
Okay, thank you. It's okay.
Not because of this.
So I know why I like Shay Agnon, although I did suffer through him as in my final high school years here. When Agnon was back in Germany overseeing the publication of his works under Schocken, he would write to his wife about the hideously boring bourgeois German family of her sister, who would entertain him in Germany. I am a descendant of that hideously boring bourgeois German family, and so I have great affections for my great-great-uncle Shay. But I want to ask the two of you who are not related, why Agnon? What was it about the man and his writings? I mean, you both come with this wealth of literary knowledge, both in Jewish texts, in modern Western works.
We are both. I don't think I have. You can say about me.
I also grew up on Baba, okay?
Okay.
You know what you're talking about. And I want to ask why, of all the things you could have drawn on, why the fascination with Shay Agnon?
For me, it's because of the fullness of associations when I read his text. And I see so many pictures that I can't leave it like that and only for me, only for myself. I've got to share it with others. Otherwise, my mind will explode. I think this is the main motive.
More than other authors.
More than?
More than when you read other.
Of course, much more, because Agnon, when you're talking about Agnon's language, which is, I heard people saying that Agnon is the language. This is what he's so great about. But I think his language is built on so many levels of what was written before, so many canonic texts. So this is what reflect in my mind all these pictures coming from all over the Jewish legacy through the years.
My answer to the question is a little more complicated, and partially because many of you are. I'm so flattered that so many of you are here in this kind of journey of these past 10 years since I went full immersion into the Agnon world. I've had the lucky opportunity of learning and teaching and studying with so many of you. So you've probably heard different iterations of this story before. The problem is it never comes out the same twice. There are two short answers. There are two to tell shortly. In high school, when I was becoming interested in things Jewish, coming from a rather non-engaged Jewish family, I had a grandmother who was she was a very cultured woman, and she bought for me a copy of what was then called 21 Stories. In our edition, it was expanded to 35 stories, a book called A Book That Was Lost. But when a foreign author would win the Nobel, so the American publisher would rush out some collection or quick translation, or they would anthologize existing short stories to capitalize on. I'm told publishers like to capitalize on the ability to sell books for some reason.
No, not this one.
Is this true?
He does it just for the love of it.
It's a rather uneven collection of stories that had been published in different platforms throughout the years. And I guess because I was becoming interested in Jewish things, she bought it for me. I don't even, frankly, know if she had read it herself. But she was the kind of woman who, if a Hebrew author won a Nobel Prize sitting in Jerusalem, she would have taken note of him. I read it in high school, and I was very engaged with what he wrote. At that time, obviously, I could not have read him in Hebrew, and even if I could, all of his allusions, all the intertextual work would have gone completely over my head. But I understood that he was saying something very profound about the relationship between tradition and modernity, and the movement from the old world to the new, and things that in my own way, in a very different way, but in my own way, I was undergoing as I was making this process of return to Jewish life and engagement and learning. And it remained, just something that was on my reading list when a new translation would come out, to encounter it, to read it. When I came on Aliyah this summer, it'll be 25 years ago. I've told this story here before. 25 years ago, this summer, when I came on Aliyah, you opened a cafe. It was a cafe, bookshop, with an Agnon theme. And I came here, then it was just the other side, right? And I bought a copy of Tmol Shel Agnon's novel about Aliyah. I have no idea how I knew what the novel was about, because it hadn't yet been translated. But I figured I'm an Oleh Chadash, it's the story of an Oleh Chadash, but I could not read it. My Hebrew was not sufficient. And it was a good thing, because it had a tragic tale of someone who's defeated by his attempt to settle the land. And then in time, like everything else, Hebrew also improves. And when our kids were young, we used to sometimes read Agnon stories on Friday night. And, it remained as a hobby. And then a little over 10 years ago, completely as a fluke, I just went into this deep immersion project of reading and studying, and my friend Mark said, "Oh, I know you, in a couple of years you'll be running the place." I didn't believe him, but but somehow it was a hobby that got away from itself. And then actually, I'll add my word of thanks to Matthew Miller, who had this crazy idea to let's commission new translations and reissue the old ones. And I said, we can't just reissue them, we have to revise them, we have to improve them. And I think when we started, it was going to be 5 books, and every year or so I'd say, well, we can also do this one, we can do that one. Before we were done, it was 15 books, and I mean, we're celebrating the completion now, but maybe in the future we'll do some more.
I just can't wait to make copies.
So David, it's really your fault, isn't it? So going back to now bringing the two together, speaking about translation and Agnon, I think part of the motivation in navigating the stormy seas of translation is trying to get to a new destination, specifically a new audience, a readership that was not part of the original audience. Jeff, in your case, it's English speakers. Shay, in your case, it's young adults.
No, it's me.
It's you.
If young adults will love Agnon because of what I did, it's great, but this was not my aim.
You weren't trying to reach a younger readership for Agnon.
You know, I can't say it strictly, because at first I published it in a youth magazine, so actually yes, but it was for me.
It was for you. All right, so not you, Jeff, this is you.
Okay.
אתה רוצה לצייר תוך כדי?
אולי כן, אבל לא חושב שסתם, אלא נדבר על זה אולי תכף, על הרוח אולי, אבל בסדר.
So I want to ask you, Jeff and Shay, if you would like to answer.
Okay.
Why specifically this target audience, and what were some of the challenges that faced you as you tried to navigate your way to this new readership?
Look, in other words, I got engaged in this whole cluster of things, the work at the Agnon House and the work on the series and my own teaching and things like that, partially with the desire to, the idea that Jewish life and literature and learning, the world of the Beit Midrash, the world of the library, the world of culture, these aren't quite as delineated as I once thought they were. And that, you know, while, look, as a rabbi, as a teacher of Torah, my principal commitments are still to Torah study conventionally defined. But there's room out there for lots of, it seems to me we have time for lots of other things, not all of which is quite as ennobling as great literature. And that in our world, I'm not here speaking denominationally of one particular, earlier we spoke about different sects of Judaism, but the world of people that are Jewishly engaged with Jewish learning, engaged with Jewish life, whether here in Israel or abroad, this is something that can really be a drill to get down deep and to think about things and to open up. And I'm amazed by the responses that we've gotten and how it resonates. And
could you give some examples?
Well, last year I was in New York. I have a good friend who's the rabbi of the Lincoln Square Synagogue, and I was a scholar in residence in Manhattan at the synagogue. And Shabbos afternoon, I'm walking down the block with my friend Rabbi Shaul Robinson, and he sees someone, and you're laughing because you know the punchlines. And he introduces me. Now Robinson is British, and he's got that accent. And he introduces me. He's Scottish. He introduces me to his friend. He says, "This is my friend Rabbi Sachs." And
there is another Rabbi Sachs. Some of you might have heard of it.
But he spells his name wrong. So his friend's eyes widen, and he says, "Rabbi Sachs, it's such an honor to meet you. I read all of it." I'm like, oh God. What's the right response here? Like, in other words, should I try to spare him the embarrassment? Should I put on the British accent? Like, I'm thinking, how can it possibly? You ever see Jonathan Sachs? He sleeps in custom tailored suits. So, how can he possibly think of Jonathan Sachs? So, but I put on the British accent and say, "Thank you very much to meet you." And then he won't be embarrassed. course, he'll think he shook hands with Jonathan Sachs. Or do I be honest? And I said, listen, I'm sorry, there's the other Rabbi Sachs, Jeff Sachs. And he says, I know. I'm a big fan of Agnon. So I took that as a sign that if on the west side of Manhattan we could make an impression like that, we're doing something. And people that are reading and studying and teaching Agnon and other related areas with the goal of trying to further people's connections to this whole world of positive associations. On the other hand, we're also interested in selling books, and we're just as happy that people who aren't necessarily Jewishly engaged by the books. And I'm amazed by I got an email not long ago from a Polish, not Jewish, a Polish man who's married to a Chinese woman, and they live in a remote province in China.
Wow.
And somehow he got a couple of the books on Kindle before they got blocked off by some firewall in China. And he wanted to know how he could get more, what was the best way for him to get copies of the books. And he's writing to me about what he's getting out of these books. And there's a professor, believe it or not, there's a professor of Semitic languages in the University of Saudi, in the Saudi Arabian University in Riyadh. His Hebrew is better than mine. And he teaches Agnon in Hebrew, there are a number of Arabic translations of Agnon of some short stories. And he's a really very careful reader of Agnon and learned in Agnon. And so he reached out to me, and we've been we're trying to figure out how we can get him to Israel, for a kind of joint Agnon bringing peace across the world. But I take these things as signs that there's a resonance out there in the bigger world.
Shay, any surprising, gratifying feedback you got you'd like to share?
Maybe about your former question, I would like to להדגים, to
illustrate.
Yes, to illustrate. תודה. One reason why making a comics out of Agnon's text. Like I'll take מעשה העז, the tale of
Fable
the goat. Fable of the goat. Agnon is telling us about the tunnel that Jews many years ago could walk after a goat through that tunnel and go from the diaspora to the land of Israel in a few hours or days. But it doesn't tell us anything about that tunnel. What does it mean, that tunnel? What he's talking about? And when I have
Shay.
Okay. להצגיר אותה מחדש קטן. בסדר, רואים? עוד קצת. When we have a goat in front of a hole in the ground, a tunnel, but it can be, in my imagination, like the first thing I'm thinking of when I see it in my mind is Sa'ir Le'azazel. I don't know how to translate it. Scapegoat? Scape. Okay, so there must be a Kohen somewhere here that will throw it to that hole in the ground, tehom, but in our story it's a tunnel or a cave. But when I'm thinking of a creature, בעל חיים, איך אומרים בעל חיים? Animal, טוב, במקרה הזה זה לא בדיוק animal, זה בהמה, אבל when we are talking about an animal going into a hole in the ground, I'm thinking of Alice in Wonderland as well. Chasing an animal into a hole in the ground and finding herself in Wonderland, like the land of Israel. So they are both here. And thinking of Alice in Wonderland, there are all these creatures which are personalized objects, like glasses that became like birds. And maybe because of thinking of these creatures, they remind me a scene in the movie The Wall of Pink Floyd. Of hammers. Of hammers in a fascistic parade, a very strong scene in that movie. And with all these associations in my mind, at first it's a great balagan, a great mess, but when they are shokim, I have a pass of a tunnel that will take us from the diaspora to the land of Israel. And when I have it in my mind, I can't keep it just for myself like that.
I think that deserves a round of applause. So, one final question, and then maybe we'll open it to some questions from the floor if anyone has any. I asked you about the ultimate destination of the translation, about the readers. I want to ask you about the point of departure. I want to ask you about the author. I'm particularly curious to know what you think Shay Charka would have thought of the work that you do. If Shay Charka were seeing this picture now, what would he say?
I ask myself about it very oftenly, but I can't give an answer. I really don't know. Sometimes it could be frightened, but I really don't know. I hope it will bless me for it. He will bless me for it, but I can't really know. Yeah, maybe Jeff can say.
Jeff, what would Alan say about Shay's picture?
I think you would love it. I think you would be delighted that people. He always had this lifelong concern that people should be reading him. He was always interested in knowing, are they teaching him in school? So the idea that we're making, I think Shay's work is, often understood or interpreted to be for kids, but it's really so much more than that. But there's no doubt that kids love it. My kids certainly do. And I've gone to places in America or England and taught in day schools and elementary schools. And good luck go trying to teach Agnon in an American day school, but you bring them copies of Maseh Ha'ez with illustrations, you show it, with a projector on the screen, and they open up to it. They immediately connect with what Shay is trying to do, and then they open themselves up to the experience of reading Agnon, which is, I think, successful and would have brought him. We know in terms of the translation that Agnon was always interested in being translated, and he was being translated very early on, first into German in the teens and 20s, and then later into English, already from the 1930s. There was a very clear understanding that committees in Stockholm don't tend to take notice of authors whose writing is not translated out of Hebrew. And to be a world-class author on the international stage, you have to have translation. As a matter of fact, when he won the Nobel, he wasn't always the most generous, gracious person.
Remind you of the hideously boring bourgeois family.
Right, yes. And he seems to have neglected to thank his patron and publisher, Mr. Shokin, but he thanked the translators who made his work available to a bunch of fellas in Stockholm taking note of his work.
Any questions on the floor? Yes.
I want to know if you do other, you
Sorry?
illustrate other.
רגע, צריך לדבר למיקרופון, אחרת לא שומעים מאחור.
Do you illustrate other authors or only Agnon?
I illustrate other authors, but I don't interpreting their work into comics. It's really different. I'm telling Agnon stories in comics, and I'm not looking at myself as an illustrator of his texts.
I'm sorry, I must add, one of the very significant things about the two Agnon works is you did not feel the need to adapt Agnon's words. The words in the thought bubbles above the characters are Agnon's words themselves. You didn't try to finesse it so it would be a little easier on the young reader, and I think that's very significant.
Any other questions? Yes.
If you want to get a wider audience, people don't read today, so have to put all those books into digital form. Because I know my children, when they go walking, they have a book, an English book on
an audio book.
An audio book. Nobody reads anymore.
They're all in electronic. The publisher very much wants you all to know that the books all exist in electronic form.
But not in audio.
Not in audiobooks yet, but they do all exist on Kindle. Yes.
Could you give us, you or the other translators, an example of one of your most challenging dilemmas?
Rena's asking about.
One second.
And then
I'll just repeat. Rena's just asking if any of the translators can give an example of particularly challenging knots that we had to untie in the translation.
Every sentence.
Mike?
Something that stands out.
I translated my Rotemont books for the 14th volume with my friend and colleague Rabbi Carl Perkins in Newton, Massachusetts. I had to do the section in which there was a letter that's written in, it's a makama, it's a rhymed prose. So at that point you really can't say all the things that the character says. It's impossible. You have to do what the author would have done had the author written in English. You cannot translate the words, you can only reproduce the effect. That was hard.
Thank you.
Any other examples?
Shay has an answer.
No, sir.
One of the characters from Food to a Friend, one of the main characters is the wind. Agnon call it haruach, and in Hebrew it can be a wind, it can be a ghost, it can be spirit, and maybe more, which I don't know. But for me, even after I decided that it's a wind, how do you make how can you personify,
Anthropomorphize
a wind? I can make a person out of a microphone, out of any object, but the wind is not an object. So how do I do it? And this was quite challenging. Yes. And so I thought, what is a wind? A wind is actually a motion. It's the motion itself. And how do I draw motion if I want to draw a person moving? Let's say he's running now.
Put some shorts on.
I can't say that I can see the movement of his body when I draw him like that. I miss a few lines for the motion. The motion will come from this kind of lines. These are the lines that makes the motion in the drawing. So if I want to create a person which is the motion itself, I need to use this kind of lines as a material for him. So my wind will be a character that comes out of lines of motion. Motion blur maybe is the right term. So this is the wind. If we are talking about my work as a translation.
Was there another translator? Yes. Did you want to speak about your translating experience?
No, a question.
By all means. Yes.
A question for Yael. Jeff mentioned how Shay, in his speech bubbles, keeps the original language of the quotes. And I was wondering to what extent, in the play in the amazing play that we just witnessed, to what extent did you keep the original language of the translation, especially considering that the translation was done not for the stage but for reading? To what extent did you find you had to adapt it, and to what extent did you preserve the original?
So the play, the story itself is 45 to 50 pages. No? The story is 45 to 50 pages. I took one of the narratives in the story, ignored some of the others in order to give the whole story, and I reduced it to 5 pages, 4.5. 95% of the language I kept. And only where, because I had cut pretty brutally, there would be some kind of misunderstanding, did I add or adapt a few words here and there. I tried, this is not my field, but I tried to make my words match those of the translator. She'll be able to say later if I succeeded, but 95%. Because I thought it was important, that's what it's all about, the words. And the images, of course.
To conclude, I'd like to turn the rights over to Jeff for some further comments.
Well, again, I would just thank you all so much, not just for being here tonight, but for so many of you for being part of this journey. Many of you were very helpful. Avi and Tara, were particularly helpful over the years, and I'm so flattered that the Dean of Agnon Scholars, Professor Avram Holtz, and his wife, Dr. Toby Holtz, honor us with their presence tonight. Avram has been at work for many, 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 many years on what will be among the most significant contributions to the field of Hebrew literary studies in general, and Agnon in particular, and we're all waiting to see that day, as we know he is. But I do thank both Avram and Toby for their incredible support and encouragement of the project, and for making their vast knowledge and resources available to me at every twist and turn of the translating challenges and the annotating challenges that presented themselves. I already said nice things about Matthew Miller, but I'll just say that in the history of the intellectual history of Jewish life in the early 21st century in the English-speaking world gets written one day in a doctorate, the role of Koren and Toby and Magid will be a very significant portion of that, and I know no one is more surprised about this than the fact that you're going to end up as a footnote one day in a doctorate. But we do thank you for everything that you've done. For learning now and for many years to come. Early on in this escapade, there was a ring on the phone at home. My wife, Ilana, answered the phone, and somebody said, "Is this the home of Jeffrey Sachs, the Agnon scholar?" And she was like, "Yes." And that's how I don't think either of us knew where this was going to lead. But I thank her for being along on this interesting journey. Thank you to all participating tonight. To Yael and her troupe, and if you have a chance to see any of their productions, you should make it your business to do so for theater and theology. To Shay, of course, and especially to Gila, who, on the production side of things, learning what it means to edit, learning what it means to work with translators, taught me so much. I would just close with one final thought before David maybe has a few things to say. I read recently that in Greek, there are two forms of modern Greek. There's the classic Greek of Homer, but there's what's called demotic Greek, demos, the language of the people, the common everyday language you hear on the streets of Athens. And there's something called kataravusa, from the language of catharsis, purified Greek. It's a completely artificial language. It was invented in the 19th century by a group of Greek nationalists that wanted to try to yoke the everyday language to anchor it back in the classical roots of classical ancient Greek literature. And for many decades, it was the official language of the nation of Greece. Court records had to be filed in this kataravusa, this kind of highfalutin language. It wasn't the kind of language the cab driver and people in the shuk could necessarily speak fluently. At a certain point, a number of decades ago, it was I think, all but abolished for official purposes. But when I read this, I thought, well, that's precisely what Agnon is doing. Agnon is trying to imagine what Hebrew language and literature, and maybe even Jewish life and culture, could or should have been without what he called the Katastrophe Historit, the historic catastrophe. Shatitus melech Rome iba v'chriv Yerushalayim v'gala Yisrael me'artzo noladati ani b'achat Maria gola, like he said in the Nobel speech, because of what happened on what he claimed was his birthday, Tisha B'Av. That the Jewish history went on pause for 2,000 years. Jewish history, the way it was supposed to be, went on pause for 2,000 years, imagining how the language and the literature and the life might have evolved if done so directly from the language of, let's say, classical rabbinic literature. And it's not actually rabbinic literature. It's this kind of ersatz. It's a kind of artificial creation. It's an imaginative language, this Agnonian. But it engages us. It pulls us into something so much more than the story itself. I think that we succeeded, and again, it wasn't me. It was a team of so many people, some of whom are long since dead. We resurrected their long-lost translations, tried to polish them up. I think that we together succeeded in drawing readers into that. And that is something that can translate. And that is something that is accessible to the English reader. To understand that he's somehow reading a modern story, but is in dialogue with the whole canon of Jewish literature, going back to Tanakh, through rabbinic literature, medieval Hebrew literature, and so on and so forth. And if we've succeeded in engaging people at that level, then I think it's been a great success indeed. And thank you all so much.